If the deepest pain in your life right now is not coming from strangers, enemies, or the world outside your door, but from the quiet distance growing inside your own family, then stay with this message for a while, because what you are feeling may be one of the most painful and most misunderstood parts of walking closely with God. There are wounds that come from obvious betrayal, and there are wounds that come from silence. There are heartbreaks caused by rejection, and there are heartbreaks caused by a slow fading of warmth that no one ever names. Sometimes you still sit at the same table, hear the same voices, remember the same childhood rooms, and yet something in the atmosphere has changed so deeply that even familiar love begins to feel far away. You may still be connected by blood, by history, by duty, by memory, and yet in your spirit you know that something is no longer the same. The conversations are shorter, the understanding is thinner, the closeness that once felt natural now feels strained. You speak, but you are not heard the same way. You stay, but you no longer feel fully known. You try to explain your heart, but the words do not land. And the worst part is that this kind of pain often comes without a clean ending. There is no single dramatic moment to point to. There is only the ache of realizing that the people who once felt like home now feel like a place your soul cannot fully rest. That kind of pain can make a person question everything. It can make you wonder whether you did something wrong, whether your heart has become too sensitive, whether your faith has made you strange, whether your growth has cost too much, whether love is disappearing, whether God is asking for something cruel. It can make you feel guilty for feeling hurt and lonely at the same time. It can make you feel torn between honoring your family and being honest about the fact that something is deeply broken in the closeness you once knew. And because family is supposed to be the place of comfort, this kind of distance can wound more deeply than almost any other trial. When strangers misunderstand you, it hurts, but when family no longer understands you, it touches something primal. It reaches into the oldest parts of your identity. It shakes memories, expectations, belonging, and the simple human desire to be received by those who know your name before anyone else does. But there is a painful truth that many people only discover after years of confusion. Sometimes distance from family is not proof that God has abandoned you. Sometimes it is part of how He leads you. Sometimes what feels like loss is actually refinement. Sometimes what feels like rejection is the beginning of protection. Sometimes what feels like relational failure is the place where calling becomes clear. And sometimes the ache of family distance is not the end of love, but the evidence that your life is being reoriented around a deeper allegiance than the one you used to live by. This does not make the pain small. It does not make tears unnecessary. It does not mean you stop loving the people who raised you, shaped you, corrected you, carried you, or hurt you. It simply means that the hand of God can move even through the sorrow of changed relationships. And when He does, He is often doing more than your emotions can interpret in the moment. The Bible never pretends that family tension is a minor issue. Scripture does not hide it under soft language or avoid the reality of how painful it can be when the people closest to you cannot walk where God is leading you. Jesus Himself spoke with startling honesty about this. He warned that loyalty to Him would sometimes divide households. He revealed that devotion to God could create tension where people expected comfort. He made it clear that following Him was not always going to preserve the emotional peace of every relationship. Those words can sound severe until you have lived them. They can seem harsh until you know what it feels like to love your family sincerely and still sense that your obedience to God has placed you on a road they do not understand and may never fully approve of. Then suddenly the words of Jesus stop sounding abstract. They become painfully personal. They become the mirror of your own life. There are seasons when God begins to deepen your heart, and the first people to feel the difference are the people who knew the version of you that required less truth, less courage, less clarity, and less surrender. You may not have intended to change the atmosphere. You may not have been trying to become distant. You may not have set out to disrupt anything, but once your spirit begins aligning more deeply with God, your values begin to shift. Your conversations change, your desires change, your tolerance for certain patterns weakens. The compromises you used to make no longer feel peaceful. The version of you that stayed quiet to keep everyone comfortable begins to fade. And without trying to create tension, you start becoming harder to fit into old dynamics. This is one of the most heartbreaking parts of real transformation. Growth is beautiful in the eyes of God, but it can feel threatening to the people who are most used to the old version of you. Maybe that is where you are right now. You have not stopped loving your family. In many ways, you may love them more deeply than ever. But your spirit has changed, and now the old ways of relating feel impossible. Maybe they still expect you to be the one who says yes to everything. Maybe they still speak to you as if you are the person you were years ago. Maybe they do not understand your need for boundaries, quiet, prayer, healing, or spiritual clarity. Maybe every time you move closer to the person God is shaping, someone close to you calls it pride, distance, rebellion, or coldness. That misunderstanding hurts because part of you wants to be seen, and part of you knows that being fully seen may require a kind of spiritual eyesight they do not yet have. You may feel as though you are losing your place in the family simply because you are no longer willing to lose your soul. This is why the distance feels sacred and painful at the same time. It is not just relational discomfort, it is the sound of something being rearranged at the deepest level. It is the grief of realizing that growth changes relationships, and not everyone who loved you in one season will understand who God is calling you to become in the next. This does not mean they are evil. It does not mean you are superior. It means the path of God sometimes bends in a direction that family affection alone cannot explain or sustain. There are moments when the Lord begins lifting your life toward a deeper purpose, and the first thing He disturbs is your dependence on familiar approval. When God called Abraham, He did not begin by strengthening his attachment to what was familiar. He began with departure. He told him to leave his country, his people, and his father's household, and go to a land He would later reveal. That command was not merely geographic, it was spiritual. It was God saying that destiny sometimes begins where familiarity ends. Abraham's family background was not presented as a simple villain in the story. The issue was not that comfort itself was evil. The issue was that calling required movement, and movement required separation. Before promise became visible, distance became necessary. Before blessing took form, a familiar world had to be left behind. That pattern appears again and again in Scripture. God often leads His people out before He leads them in. He removes them from what shaped them before He reveals what He is making them into. That pattern matters because many people interpret family distance only through the language of conflict. They assume that if separation exists, then hatred must be the cause. But the Bible shows something more complex and more painful. Sometimes separation is not caused by open hostility. Sometimes it is caused by calling. Sometimes it emerges because God is forming something in you that cannot fully mature while you remain emotionally governed by the expectations of those closest to you. Sometimes the people who love you cannot yet love the version of you that truth is producing. They may love who you were when you were easier to predict, easier to control, easier to guilt, easier to silence, easier to define. But once God begins reshaping your inner life, the familiar arrangement becomes unstable, not because you are betraying them, but because the Spirit of God is no longer allowing you to betray yourself. That is one of the quiet tragedies of spiritual growth. The closer you move toward who God created you to be, the more foreign you may seem to the people who are most attached to the self you once performed. They may say you are too intense now, too guarded, too serious, too prayerful, too changed, too different. But underneath those words is often something they cannot articulate. They are grieving the loss of an old pattern. They are feeling the discomfort of no longer being able to relate to you through the same old expectations. And if you are not careful, their discomfort can make you question whether obedience is worth the loneliness that follows it. But hear this clearly. God does not call you to stay spiritually small so that others can remain emotionally comfortable. He calls you to truth, even when truth changes the atmosphere of your closest relationships. There are times when family becomes more than a source of love. It becomes a source of influence that quietly resists your growth. This is not always loud or obvious. It does not always arrive in cruel words or direct opposition. Sometimes it comes in the form of subtle pressure. Pressure to stay who you used to be. Pressure to keep peace at the expense of truth. Pressure to avoid boundaries. Pressure to make choices that preserve family approval while weakening spiritual clarity. Pressure to remain emotionally available in ways that drain your soul and leave no room for what God is building in you. This kind of pressure is hard to name because it hides under the language of loyalty, tradition, or care. But anything that repeatedly pulls you away from obedience, peace, or truth must be seen clearly, even if it comes from people you love. Jesus spoke about this with uncomfortable honesty. He made it clear that no earthly relationship, no matter how precious, could sit above devotion to God. That does not mean family loses value. It means family cannot become an idol. It means the love of father, mother, siblings, spouse, or children cannot become stronger than your surrender to the one who gave you life. This is not cold theology. It is practical survival for the soul. Because once family approval becomes your highest need, you will compromise truth to preserve closeness. You will silence convictions to maintain peace. You will ignore what God is saying to avoid disappointing those whose opinions have too much authority over your heart. The result is always the same. Outward harmony may remain for a while, but inward peace disappears. Some of the most damaging spiritual obstacles in life do not look like temptation in the usual sense. They look like familiar voices asking you to stay where you no longer belong. They look like loved ones discouraging the very faith that is saving your life. They look like emotional bonds so strong that you begin calling disobedience compassion and compromise honor. This is why God sometimes allows distance, not to destroy the relationship, but to expose what closeness has been doing to your spirit. A little space can reveal what constant contact kept hidden. A season of silence can reveal what noise kept buried. When you step back, you begin noticing the patterns more clearly. You begin seeing how often your peace disappeared after certain conversations. You begin understanding how your identity weakened when you spent too much time trying to be understood by people who only honored older versions of you. You begin realizing that some forms of closeness were costing more than you admitted. Distance in those moments is not cruelty. It is mercy. It is God protecting what is tender in you before it gets trampled by familiarity. It is God keeping your calling from being slowly suffocated by the expectations of people who cannot yet see where He is taking you. It is God teaching you that love does not require the destruction of your soul. It is God revealing that honor and obedience are not enemies, but they must be ordered correctly. You can honor family without surrendering the voice of God in your life. You can love deeply without agreeing to be spiritually diminished. You can pray for reconciliation without offering your peace as the price. There is another painful truth hidden in family distance. Sometimes it is not just about influence. Sometimes it is about identity. When God begins transforming you, the people who knew your former self may feel as if they are losing you, even when you are finally becoming more real than you have ever been. They may accuse you of changing as though change were betrayal. They may speak as though the old version of you was the true version, and the new one is a rejection of everything they know. But Scripture teaches that transformation is not optional for the believer. In Christ, the old passes and the new begins. The renewing of the mind is not a side note of faith. It is part of the work itself. God does not merely improve your habits. He reshapes the way you see, think, desire, respond, and live. That kind of change can be celebrated in heaven and misunderstood in your own home. Perhaps your family misses the version of you that tolerated more, feared more, doubted more, and needed more of their approval. Perhaps they were comfortable with the self that stayed small, apologized quickly, explained too much, and never drew firm lines. But God did not create you to remain manageable. He created you to become whole. He created you to stand in truth. He created you to be renewed, not preserved in broken patterns just because those patterns made other people feel safe. Real transformation always disturbs what was built on the old version of you. That does not mean your growth is wrong. It means your growth is real. This is why so many people feel lonely when they first begin becoming who God actually called them to be. They are not grieving the absence of strangers. They are grieving the inability of familiar people to recognize the holy work unfolding in them. They look around and realize that the more honest they become, the less simple the old relationships feel. The more they heal, the less they can participate in old dysfunction without feeling it in their spirit. The more they surrender, the more obvious it becomes that some forms of closeness were maintained by pretending, pleasing, and suppressing who they truly were. That realization hurts. It can make you feel guilty, ungrateful, and torn. But it is also part of how God rewrites a life. He exposes what was built on false peace so that something truer can eventually stand. Not every family wound is loud. Some are subtle enough to be mistaken for normal. Some harm arrives wrapped in concern. Some damage is carried through patterns that never announce themselves as destructive because they are too woven into the atmosphere of the home. It may be constant criticism that slowly teaches you to distrust yourself. It may be emotional manipulation that disguises control as love. It may be spiritual discouragement that makes prayer, conviction, and obedience feel excessive. It may be a pattern of guilt that punishes every boundary you try to build. It may be favoritism, silence, unpredictability, or the quiet expectation that you remain available to everyone while no one truly tends to the state of your own soul. This kind of harm is easy to minimize because it does not always leave visible bruises. But God sees what it does to the heart. He sees how repeated exposure slowly erodes identity. He sees how constant emotional strain weakens peace. He sees how certain patterns keep you from fully hearing His voice. That is why distance can sometimes be an act of divine rescue. God is not waiting for obvious destruction before He intervenes. Sometimes He creates space early. Sometimes He allows a relationship to cool, because constant closeness would quietly damage your soul beyond what you realize. Lot had to be pulled out before judgment fell. Moses had to be led into wilderness before purpose was revealed. David had to leave familiar safety and walk through lonely terrain before kingship matured in him. Again and again, God separates before He establishes. He removes before He entrusts. He creates distance not because He delights in your tears, but because He refuses to leave you exposed to what would slowly crush the life He placed in you. The hardest part of this is that rescue does not always feel like rescue at first. It often feels like loss. It feels like unanswered text messages, awkward visits, empty holidays, misunderstood choices, and the ache of realizing that home no longer feels simple. It feels like wondering why the people who should celebrate your growth seem unsettled by it. It feels like carrying grief that other people dismiss because nothing dramatic has happened. But what if the very thing you are mourning is the space God is using to keep you spiritually alive? What if the silence is giving your heart room to breathe? What if the distance is the boundary you were too tender to draw yourself? What if the cooling of a relationship is keeping your faith from being quietly extinguished by patterns you have normalized for too long? There are seasons when God teaches His children dependence by removing familiar supports. This is one of His hardest lessons and one of His holiest. As long as human approval remains the pillar beneath your identity, you will never fully discover what it means to be held by God alone. As long as family comfort is the place you run first, your soul may never learn the deep stability that comes from divine intimacy. This is why some of the most transforming seasons begin with loneliness. God allows certain voices to grow quiet so that His own voice can become clearer. He allows certain emotional structures to weaken so that you will stop building your security on people who were never meant to carry the weight of being your foundation. Jacob experienced this in the night when he was left alone. Alone, he wrestled. Alone, he was changed. Alone, he received a new name. Solitude did not mean God had abandoned him. Solitude was the setting where transformation became unavoidable. There are things God does in private that no crowd can participate in. There are identities He forms in silence that family cannot confer. There are wrestlings that only happen when the last familiar support has been stripped away, and you are face to face with the God who sees what you are becoming. Family distance often pushes a person into this exact kind of encounter. You are left with your fears, your longings, your grief, your unmet need for approval, and the question of whether God is enough when the usual comforts feel far away. It is a brutal question, but it is also a sacred one. Because until the heart discovers that God is enough, it will keep demanding from people what only heaven can provide. This does not mean your need for human love is wrong. It means that love becomes disordered when it becomes the substitute for God's presence. The psalmist knew this when he said that even if father and mother forsook him, the Lord would receive him. That was not a celebration of human neglect. It was a confession of divine sufficiency. It was the voice of someone who had learned that no human bond, however precious, could occupy the throne of the soul. When family grows distant, this lesson becomes painfully practical. You begin to discover what you actually believe about God's nearness. You begin to see whether your trust survives when familiar reassurance disappears. You begin to realize that loneliness is not always empty. Sometimes it is crowded with the quiet work of God. There are some people listening to this who have spent years trying to rebuild family closeness through over-explanation, over-availability, over-giving, and over-functioning. You have tried to be more patient, more understanding, more silent, more helpful, more forgiving, more flexible, more careful with your words, more willing to overlook what hurt. You have worked hard to preserve connection, and yet despite all of that effort, the distance remained. If that is your story, hear this with tenderness. Not every relationship can be healed by your labor alone. Not every silence can be mended by trying harder. Not every misunderstanding is yours to solve. There are times when God allows you to reach the end of your ability so that you will finally stop trying to save a relationship through the sacrifice of your own peace. You cannot build true closeness by abandoning truth. You cannot create mutual understanding by denying what wounds you. And you cannot make someone walk with the person God is shaping you to be if they are determined to remain attached only to who you used to be. Sometimes the distance itself becomes the place where God reveals your true assignment. Before he sends people into greater purpose, he often loosens their ties to what keeps them emotionally anchored in the old. New seasons rarely begin with comfort. They begin with dislocation. Abraham had to leave. Moses had to be hidden in wilderness. Joseph had to be separated from his brothers. David had to be called from fields no one respected. Jesus himself stepped beyond the expectations of Nazareth because the familiarity of his hometown could not contain the weight of his mission. A prophet is often least honored by those who know his ordinary history. Why? Because familiarity can blind people to calling. They see the child they once corrected, the sibling they once teased, the son or daughter they once instructed. They do not easily see the person God is raising up for something beyond the categories they understand. That reality can be heartbreaking when it happens in your own family. The people you hoped would recognize the hand of God on your life may be the very ones who minimize it. They may still speak to you as though your future must remain small enough to fit their understanding. They may still define you by your past mistakes, your old insecurities, your former dependence, or the role you played in the family system. But God is not bound by how familiar people remember you. He does not ask permission from those closest to you before he calls you higher. He does not suspend your destiny until everyone around you approves. Sometimes he lets the misunderstanding remain because approval would keep you attached to the wrong version of yourself. He would rather lead you through loneliness into calling than leave you celebrated in a role that is too small for what he intends. When God is preparing you for a new assignment, he is often more concerned with your formation than your comfort. And formation requires honesty. It requires the exposure of every place where family approval has become too powerful. Every place where old roles still dictate your choices. Every place where the fear of being misunderstood keeps you from obeying. If you are called to carry something deeper in the future, God will not let you enter it while remaining chained to the emotional patterns of your past. He will break your dependence on being known in the old way. He will teach you to bear misunderstanding without collapsing. He will teach you to keep your heart soft without making your obedience negotiable. He will teach you to love without letting love become control. And in that painful schooling, family distance often becomes one of the classrooms he uses. The pain of this process should never be minimized. There are days when the distance feels like grief more than guidance. There are holidays that feel heavier than they should. There are ordinary moments when a memory rises and pierces you because you remember how simple love once felt. There are nights when you wonder whether things will ever be warm again, whether healing will come, whether the gap will close, whether the people you love will ever truly see the person you are becoming. There are prayers you whisper with tears because part of you still longs for peace, understanding, mutual honor, and a kind of nearness that does not cost you truth. Those longings are not wrong. They are deeply human. God is not offended by your grief. He is not asking you to call pain good. He is asking you to trust that pain can still become holy ground in His hands. One of the quiet miracles of this season is that God can use family distance to purify love itself. When closeness is easy, love can remain mixed with dependency, fear, obligation, performance, and unspoken demand. But when distance enters, motives get revealed. You begin learning how to love without controlling. You begin learning how to forgive without pretending. You begin learning how to honor without idolizing. You begin learning how to pray for people you cannot fix. You begin learning how to carry compassion without carrying responsibility for every outcome. This is mature love, and it is costly. It does not flourish in comfortable illusions. It grows in the tension between sorrow and surrender. It grows when you place your family back into the hands of God instead of trying to hold every broken thread together yourself. There is a holiness in reaching the place where you stop demanding that family become what only God can be. They cannot fully define you. They cannot fully secure you. They cannot carry your calling. They cannot become the final measure of whether you are loved, led, or seen. When that lesson enters the heart, a person changes. They become less reactive, less desperate, less willing to trade peace for scraps of approval. They stop bowing before every silence. They stop explaining themselves to people committed to misunderstanding. They stop shrinking so that old dynamics can remain comfortable. This does not make them hard. It makes them free. And freedom often looks like distance to those who were accustomed to your previous captivity. Perhaps part of what makes this season so painful is that you never wanted distance. You wanted peace. You wanted understanding. You wanted to remain close without betraying what God was doing in you. But love is not always enough to preserve old forms of closeness when truth begins reshaping a life. Sometimes the river still flows, but it no longer follows the old path. Sometimes affection remains, but intimacy changes. Sometimes prayer replaces conversation because conversation keeps collapsing under misunderstanding. Sometimes the best way to love a family member is from farther away, with clearer boundaries, quieter words, and a deeper dependence on God than you ever expected to need. That kind of love does not feel triumphant. It feels hidden. But hidden does not mean weak. Some of the strongest love in the world is the kind that refuses to hate while also refusing to be destroyed. If you are in that place, do not let guilt become your shepherd. Guilt will always tell you that boundaries are betrayal. That self-protection is selfishness. That obedience is cruelty. That saying no means you do not love enough. But guilt is a poor guide for the life of the Spirit. The Spirit leads through truth, peace, wisdom, conviction, and love, rightly ordered. Sometimes that love is warm and close. Sometimes it is quiet and distant. Sometimes it looks like conversation. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like staying. Sometimes it looks like stepping back. The form changes, but the heart can remain clean. You can bless from a distance. You can intercede from a distance. You can honor from a distance. And sometimes distance is the only way to keep love from being devoured by the pressure of unresolved patterns. There is also the painful reality that not everyone in your family will celebrate your becoming. Some may grieve the old version of you because that version made their own lives easier. Some may feel threatened by your healing because your healing exposes what the family learned to normalize. Some may mock your faith because your devotion convicts their compromise. Some may call your boundaries cold because they profited from your lack of them. Some may say you think you are better because they cannot imagine change that is not rooted in pride. This is why spiritual maturity must include the ability to endure being misread. If your peace depends on everyone interpreting you correctly, you will remain captive to those who see only through the lens of familiarity and self-interest. But when God anchors you more deeply, you begin surviving misunderstanding without letting it define you. Joseph knew this kind of pain, betrayed by brothers, separated from home, misunderstood in places he never would have chosen. He learned what it meant to be carried by God in the absence of family closeness. And yet his story shows something crucial. Separation was not the end of God's goodness. It was the pathway through which hidden formation occurred. Prison was not the throne, but prison prepared him for the throne. Family betrayal was not the blessing, but it became part of the road to blessing. Years later, Joseph could see what his brothers never intended. God had used the evil, the loss, the distance, and the pain to preserve life. That does not excuse the wound, but it reveals something powerful. God is able to work through even the most painful family fractures without surrendering your future to the damage they cause. That same truth appears in countless lives. The distance you are grieving may be part of a preparation you cannot yet see. God may be building strength in you that would never mature in constant emotional dependence. He may be clarifying your identity in ways that require space from the voices that defined you too narrowly. He may be teaching you how to hear him without needing a chorus of human agreement. He may be preparing you to carry peace into places where you used to carry only fear. He may be training you to love with wisdom, to discern with gentleness, and to remain rooted when the people around you are unsettled. None of that growth feels glamorous in the middle of it. Most of it feels like hidden work, but hidden work is often the most lasting. There is something else family distance teaches that few people speak about. It reveals where you still expect earthly relationships to save you from the ache of being human. Family cannot do that. Even the healthiest family cannot remove the deepest loneliness of the soul. Only God can meet a person there. This is why some people remain surrounded by relatives and still feel profoundly alone. The ache beneath the ache is spiritual. It is the need to be known fully, loved without condition, guided without confusion, received without performance, and held through every season. Human love can reflect that in part, but it cannot become the source. When God allows family distance, He often uses the emptiness to reveal what your heart has been asking of people that only He can give. That revelation can feel devastating at first, but it becomes freedom if you let it. Because once you stop requiring family to be God, you stop collapsing when they fail to be what they were never capable of becoming. This does not mean reconciliation is impossible. God is able to heal relationships in ways no human effort can manufacture. He can soften hearts, uncover truth, restore trust, and create new forms of closeness. He can redeem years of misunderstanding. He can teach families how to honor who a person is becoming instead of clinging to who they used to be. He can rebuild what seems too far gone, but even while hoping for that, you must understand something important. Reconciliation is not the same as returning to old patterns. Healing is not the same as pretending nothing happened. And restoration, if it comes, must be built on truth rather than nostalgia. God does not restore people by sending them backward into the same unexamined wounds. He restores by creating something new, something cleaner, something more honest than what existed before. So if you are praying for healing with your family, pray with open hands. Ask God for peace, for mercy, for understanding, for softened hearts, for changed patterns, for wisdom, for protection, and for clean love. But do not insist that the answer must look like a return to how things used to be. Sometimes God heals by bringing people close again. Sometimes He heals by teaching you how to live without the closeness you once thought you needed. Sometimes the miracle is restored relationship. Sometimes the miracle is restored identity. Sometimes both happen. Sometimes only one does. But in every case, God's aim is not merely to soothe your emotions for a moment. His aim is to establish truth, peace, and wholeness at a deeper level than sentiment alone can reach. There may be times in this season when you feel forgotten, especially when you see other people surrounded by family warmth that seems effortless. You may wonder why your story feels harder, why your path contains more distance, more misunderstanding, more emotional complexity than you expected. Do not interpret another person's ease as proof that your process is wrong. God's dealings with each life are particular. Some are called to remain close while being transformed. Others are led through separation because separation is where their truest shaping must occur. The path is different, but the faithfulness of God is the same. He has not singled you out for cruelty. He has not chosen you for abandonment. He is working in the exact terrain of your life, and if family distance is part of that terrain, He knows how to meet you there with enough grace for every mile. There is a reason the Lord is described as close to the brokenhearted. Brokenhearted people no longer have the illusion of self-sufficiency. They know they need nearness beyond what this world can offer. Family distance can create exactly that kind of brokenness. It strips away sentimental assumptions. It exposes dependence. It reveals longing. It makes you cry in prayers you never would have prayed if life had stayed comfortable. And right there, in the place where human closeness cannot fully reach, God often comes near in a way that changes everything. Not always with immediate answers, not always by restoring every relationship overnight, but with presence, with strength, with quiet stability, with a kind of companionship that does not disappear just because people grow silent. He becomes the one who remains when every human bond feels uncertain. He becomes the one who names you when family memory misnames you. He becomes the one who receives you when misunderstanding shuts familiar doors. This is how painful distance can become a door to something greater. Not because the pain itself is good, but because God is able to transform it into wisdom, depth, freedom, discernment, and intimacy with Him. The distance that once felt like pure loss becomes the terrain where your faith matures. The silence that once felt empty becomes the place where you hear God more clearly. The loneliness that once terrified you becomes the ground where identity is purified. The family misunderstanding that once made you shrink becomes the fire that teaches you to stand gently but firmly in truth. And over time, you begin to realize that what you thought was the end of something may have been the beginning of your clearest season with God. One day you may look back and see that the distance did not destroy you. It revealed you. It showed you how deeply you had depended on familiar voices. It showed you where love was tangled with fear. It showed you which parts of your obedience were still negotiable when family pressure increased. It showed you which old roles still had too much power over your choices. It showed you what God wanted to heal beneath the surface of your longing for closeness. And once you saw those things, the season changed from meaningless pain into sacred instruction. That does not erase the sorrow. It redeems it, Maybe you are in the very middle of that now. Maybe the wound is fresh. Maybe the silence is ongoing. Maybe the misunderstanding is unresolved. Maybe the people you love still cannot see why you had to change, why you had to step back, why you can no longer carry the same expectations, why your heart has become quieter, more careful, more rooted in God than in familiar approval. If that is where you are, receive this gently. You are not heartless because the distance hurts less than betrayal and more than you can explain. You are not disloyal because your obedience has created emotional tension. You are not wrong because you cannot keep sacrificing your peace to maintain a version of closeness built on ignoring what God is saying. And you are not alone, even if the road feels solitary right now. The Lord knows how to father where human fathering failed. He knows how to comfort where mothers could not reach. He knows how to be the brother who stays, the refuge that remains, the counselor who does not misread you, the shepherd who does not grow tired of your tears. He knows how to rebuild the inner architecture of belonging when family distance has made you question where home really is. In Him, home becomes more than a house, more than a last name, more than a history. It becomes presence. It becomes truth. It becomes the place where your soul can finally stop performing and simply be known. This is why some people come out of seasons of family distance more grounded than they have ever been. They did not lose the ability to love. They found the source of love more deeply than before. So do not despise this season just because it is painful. Do not call it meaningless just because it is lonely. Do not assume that every closed emotional door is proof that God has turned away. Sometimes He is closing the wrong doors so you will walk toward the right one. Sometimes He is loosening what cannot sustain you so that your roots go deeper into what can. Sometimes the family distance you never would have chosen becomes the place where calling clarifies. Identity strengthens, and the fear of human disapproval finally loses its hold. Sometimes the ache of not being understood by your family teaches you what it means to be fully held by God. And if you wonder whether the story can still become beautiful, the answer is yes, though beauty may not arrive in the way you once imagined. Sometimes beauty looks like restored conversation. Sometimes it looks like peaceful distance without bitterness. Sometimes it looks like forgiveness that no longer demands access. Sometimes it looks like grieving honestly and still blessing sincerely. Sometimes it looks like finally becoming who God made you to be, even if the people who first knew you cannot fully follow the path. In every form, beauty in this season will be rooted in God, not in the perfection of human response. That is why it can survive. That is why it can last. That is why it can carry you through, even if some prayers are answered slowly. Let this settle in you. The distance may be painful, but it is not purposeless. The loneliness may be real, but it is not empty. The misunderstanding may continue for a while, but it does not have final authority over your life. The Lord is still writing. He is still forming. He is still protecting. He is still leading. He is still drawing you away from what would quietly weaken your spirit and toward what will strengthen it. He is still using even this to deepen your faith, purify your loyalties, and teach your heart that His presence must come before every human connection. And when the story is clearer later, you may discover that the very distance you feared was the road that carried you into greater freedom, cleaner love, deeper obedience, and a relationship with God that no earthly closeness could have ever produced. So walk gently through this season, but do not walk in shame. Grieve what hurts, but do not surrender what God is doing. Pray for your family, but do not bow before every misunderstanding. Keep your heart open, but do not reopen every wound God is trying to heal. Love sincerely, honor wisely, obey bravely, and let the Lord be the one who interprets your story. He knows the full shape of what is happening. He knows the family you came from, the wounds you carry, the calling on your life, the cost of your obedience, and the form of love that will remain clean in the middle of all of this. Trust Him there. Trust Him when the room is quiet. Trust Him when the table feels colder than it used to. Trust Him when memory rises and hurts. Trust Him when your heart aches for what once was. Trust Him when you cannot tell whether the distance is forever or only for now. Trust Him even there, because in the hands of God, even family distance can become holy ground. Even separation can become preparation. Even misunderstanding can become the place where truth grows stronger. Even loneliness can become the doorway to a deeper companionship with heaven. And even the most painful silence can one day reveal itself as the place where God was drawing you closer to the kind of love no human bond could ever fully provide. When that day comes, you may still carry tenderness about what was lost, but you will also carry gratitude for what was found. You will know that the pain did not have the final word. God did, and His word over your life is not abandonment, but purpose. Not rejection, but refinement. Not emptiness, but a deeper calling into the kind of love that remains, even when everything familiar has grown quiet.